Today we will review some ideas in Part 7 of Mencius Moldbug's Letter to Open-Minded Progressives, which was published on May 29, 2008. See my previous videos on this letter for more context. Moldbug will explain to us the concept of the living constitution and the direction in which it lives. Quote, "This brings us to the third point about the public policy apparatus. While appearing unconscious of its audience, it adapts to it. This is the most incriminating point because there is no good explanation for it, and the trend is quite ominous if projected outward. Take the recent decision of the California Supreme Court, who have just discovered that the state's constitution allows people of the same sex to marry. As a matter of policy, I have no objection at all to this. Quite the contrary. I think it's an excellent and sensible policy. I do, however, have an interest in where this policy came from. This is what, in the 20th century progressive public policy world, we call law. The craft of the lawyer used to be the craft of discovering how the words of a law were intended by the officials who ratified the law to imply that one's client was in the right. I think it's fairly safe to assume that the drafters and the ratifiers of the California Constitution and its various amendments had no such understanding of their work. Try reading the actual decision. It's a fascinating hunk of boilerplate. Nonetheless, the drafters wrought better than they knew. The practice of drafting laws which are vague to the point of meaninglessness, then empowering judges to interpret them, is simply another way of abolishing politics. Congress legislates this way all the time. All they are doing is to transfer the power of legislation to a more private body, which is not subject to public scrutiny and the other painful woes of politics. The great thing about the gay marriage decision is that no one in California has any idea who made it. I think there are 9 people on the California Supreme Court. Who are they? How did they get their jobs? Who the heck knows? No one seems to care at all." End quote. We often overlook the role of the judiciary in determining what our laws are. Most people do not know how the justices of the state and federal Supreme Courts are appointed, or who they are, yet these few individuals legislate from their shadowy offices on a societally shifting level. Several years after Moldbug's blog post, the Supreme Court of the United States finally figured out that the correct interpretation of the 14th Amendment allowed for equal marriage rights for gay couples. It is strange to find that it took over 100 years to figure this out. Perhaps looking at how the Supreme Court is defined will help explain why. Moldbug takes us there. Quote, "The U.S. Constitution was the first and greatest offender in this department. Its drafters did not even agree on such basic matters as whether a state could leave the Union. In practice, it made the Supreme Court the Supreme Legislative Assembly, which over the last 200 years, mostly over the last 50, has created a body of decisions perfectly comparable to Britain's unwritten constitution that we call constitutional law. The idea that this legislative corpus can be derived in some mystical yet automatic way from the text of the Constitution is preposterous, and no one holds it." End quote. Indeed, reading the Constitution is somewhat mind-boggling. It's actually quite short, contained on 4 large pieces of paper. I recommend seeing it yourself in the National Archives before it is entirely faded. You can even read Article 3 for yourself right off the original document. Let's take a look at it. Quote, Section 1. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The judges, both of the Supreme and inferior courts, shall hold their offices during good behavior, and shall, at stated times, receive for their services a compensation, which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office. End quote. And that's basically it. The other 2 sections define the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court to be over all cases, and also treason as a crime. It does not say how many judges there should be, or much of anything else. Article 2, Section 2, defines how the President appoints these judges, at least. Quote, "He shall have the power, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties provided 2/3 of the senators present concur, and he shall nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and councils, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States, whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for, and which shall be established by law. But the Congress may, by law, vest the appointment of such inferior officers as they think proper in the President alone, in the courts of law, or in the heads of departments." End quote. We might wonder how what is apparently a simple highest court became the highest legislators, but understanding that America was founded by Englishmen explains it right away. The English common law system is the same system that we use in the United States. The body of precedent created by courts functions as legislation itself. As we saw in my gay wedding cakes video, that case was decided almost entirely by precedent and not by some novel interpretation of the law. This is how our courts work, and this is why, as Moldbug says, we don't have a mystical document from which all of this derives, but, quote, instead we have the living Constitution, which always seems to live to the left. I've never heard anyone, not even the most deranged fundamentalist, propose reinterpreting the Constitution to provide rights to fetuses, an obvious corollary of this approach. If the inner party and the outer party were symmetric opposites, and the life of the Constitution was powered by political democracy. Of course it is not. It does not rest in formal interpretation of texts. It rests in ethical judgments. It is the job of the legislator to make ethical judgments, and the California Supreme Court is doing its job. It's a pity it has to carpool with such a large bodyguard of lies, but that's the modern world for you. And we know where these ethical judgments come from. They are inner-party judgments, and the inner party's ethics are Christian, Protestant, and Quaker in their origins. Fine. We all need ethics, and applied Christianity will do as well as anything else. What interests me is when these ethical judgments come about. Imagine, for instance, that the California Supreme Court had decided in, say, 1978 that it was unconstitutional for California to prohibit its male citizens from marrying each other. Is this a thinkable event? I think not. And yet, the court's writ ran just as far and was just as powerful in 1978 as in 2008, and ethics surely have not changed. The living Constitution does not adapt with changes in ethics. It adapts with changes in public opinion, as long as that public opinion is shifting in the direction of applied Christianity. Public opinion was ready for abortion in 1973. Barely. It was ready for gay marriage in 2008. Barely. It was not ready for gay marriage in 1973. What will it be ready for in 2033? One can see this as a noble concession to the great principle of democracy. One can also see it as the Cathedral getting away with whatever it can get away with, and nothing else." End quote. The last sentence is right on the money. It is quite clear that the living Constitution lives in the direction of the Cathedral, and not in that of the populace. You can imagine the itchy trigger fingers waiting to unleash nationally legalized gay marriage at the time of Moldbug's writing, and you might quiver in fear at what they have in store next. What's next is always further to the left, and the outer party never succeeds in deterring the inner party. The outer party's entire existence can be summarized as a tacit resistance to the inner party over periods of time sufficiently long to mask the fact of the matter, that there is no real opposition party, and that the Cathedral's policies will inevitably be implemented once society has progressed enough to accept them without a serious upheaval of the status quo. We saw this happen with gay marriage. There is no real opposition to the concept now. Now we are talking about the extent to which compulsions can be laid across society in regards to how gay people are treated. Abortion is closing in on the same trajectory. There is very little opposition to abortion anymore, especially in the outer party proper. If we recall the second debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, she suggested that abortions could be done right up until birth. We are now at the point where we are arguing just how close to birth a baby can be before we can't abort it, rather than the principle of abortion itself. The next things on the horizon are, of course, transsexuals, and after that, the sexualization of children. This isn't scaremongering, as I noted in my previous video. It is already happening, and if one places any merit in the idea that the trends of history will continue on into the future, perhaps one would call this progress, then one has to realize where the future trajectory of this force will lead. We now get into the subject matter I ended the last video on, which is Moldbug's explanation of where this force leads. He explains the contradiction in what the Cathedral proclaims to represent, ethical progress, and what it actually represents, which is changes in public opinion. Quote, Larry Oster, probably the most imaginative and interesting right-wing writer on the planet, who also happens to be a converted fundamentalist Christian with all the theopolitical baggage that you, dear open-minded progressive, would expect from such a person, has a good term for this. The unprincipled exception. Briefly, an unprincipled exception is a policy that violates some absolute principle of ethics held by the policymaker, but is not openly acknowledged as such a violation. For example, dear progressive, why is racism wrong? Racism is wrong because all humans are born simply as humans, having done nothing right or wrong, and it is incompatible with our deeply held ethical principles to mark these newborn babies with indelible labels which assign them either privileges or penalties which they have not earned, such as the privilege of being able to drink at sparkling clean water fountains marked whites only, or the penalty of having to go out back to the horse trough. We hit that one out of the park, didn't we? Okay, so why is it ethical to label newborn babies as American or Mexican due to nothing but the descent and geographical position at birth of their parents, and give the former a cornucopia of benefits from which the latter is barred, such as the right to live, work, and drink from drinking fountains in the continental United States? What makes Washington think it is somehow ethical to establish two classes of human, Americans and Mexicans, based only on coincidences of birth that are just as arbitrary as black versus white, and treat the two completely differently? How does this differ from racism, Southern style? You think this is ugly? Oh, we can get worse. Let's suppose the U.S., in its eagerness to treat these second-class humans, if not as well as possible, at least better than we treat them now, establishes a new guest worker program which is open only to Nigerians. Any number of Nigerians may come to the U.S. and work. There are certain restrictions, however. They have to live in special guest worker housing. They have to go to their workplace in the morning and return before the sun sets. They may not wander around the streets at night. They must carry special guest worker passes. Obviously, they can't vote, and they are strictly prohibited from using all public amenities, including, of course, drinking fountains. Is it a more ethical policy to have this program or not to have it? If you think no Nigerians could be found to take advantage of it, you're quite wrong. If you have the program, should you cancel it and send the Nigerians home to a life of continued poverty back in Nigeria? How is this helping them? On the other hand, our program has all the major features of apartheid, and surely no apartheid is better than apartheid. There is a very easy resolution to this problem. Adopt the principle that no person is illegal. This rule is perfectly consistent with applied Christianity. It is taught at all our great universities. It is implied every time a journalist deploys the euphemism undocumented, and I'm sure there are dozens of ways in which it could be incorporated into our great living constitution. There is only one problem. The people are not quite ready for it. But perhaps in 30 years they will be? Perhaps. I would bet money on it. And I would also bet that by the time this principle is established, denying it will be the equivalent of racism. Us old fogies who were born in the 1970s will be convulsed with guilt and shame at the thought that the U.S. actually considered it ethically unacceptable to turn away, deport, and otherwise penalize our fellow human beings on the ridiculous and irrelevant grounds that they were born somewhere else. So the Cathedral wins, coming and going. Today, it does not suffer the political backlash that would be sure to ensue if the inner party endorsed opening the borders to everyone. Still less if it actually did so, unless it let the new Americans vote as soon as they set foot on our sacred soil, which of course would be the most Christian approach. And in 2038, having increased North America's population to approximately 2 billion persons, none of them illegal and all living in the same third world conditions which it has already inflicted on most of the planet, our blessed cathedral will have the privilege of berating the past with its guilt for having not recognized the obvious truth that no person is illegal. Ain't it beautiful? End quote. Let's review. It is wrong to deny humans equal rights based on chance factors of their birth, notably their racial factors, but we can still deny humans equal rights based on chance factors of their birth, notably their geographical location at the time of birth. This obvious contradiction exists through the concept of unprincipled exceptions, which serves the interest of the cathedral by holding back on certain progressive goals to avoid an all-out war that would result in its doom. But these contradictions must be inevitably resolved, as progress demands, and a progressive resolution cannot rebuke the established civil rights that are now part of the religion. The only option is to bring people across national borders into the fold, which necessitates a dissolution of those borders as a divider of people. This will occur smoothly, without political backlash sufficient to destroy the cathedral. Over a period of decades, as the cathedral sows the idea of no person being illegal through its propaganda-dispensing journalists, the opportunity will present itself not to declare by fiat this policy of open borders, but simply recognize the already present reality of it, and berate past failures of judgment in not recognizing the obviously better state of affairs that this will produce. Of course, this state of affairs will only be better in the perverse sense that everyone will share in the same dismal universal standards. We have progressed alarmingly far along this track 10 years after Moldbug's writing. The inner party is fighting hard to keep illegal immigrants in the United States, as the unexpected election of President Trump threatens to retard their plans. However, as we have discussed, he will not ultimately overthrow the cathedral. The battle is much like the one fought by Senator McCarthy that we discussed earlier. As Moldbug said, quote, if he had somehow managed to fire every Soviet agent or sympathizer in the U.S. government, he would not have even done any damage. McCarthy and his supporters thought he was attacking a nest of communist spies, whereas in fact he was attacking the American establishment, end quote. Even if President Trump materially improves the situation by deportation, legal restrictions on entry, and the wall, it will not ultimately matter, because the cathedral can simply overcome these later. By allowing more immigrants into the country, the wall will not matter if people are welcomed in. Deportation will not matter if all of these people can return. Restrictions will not matter if they are very lax. The only way to actually win is to overthrow the cathedral itself, which is the ultimate problem addressed in Moldbug's letter. Next time, we will look at some of the strategies for doing so in Part 8 of the letter. Thanks for watching.